Right, good morning everybody. Welcome to Develop in Brighton. Thank you very much for coming. Great to see so many faces here in the room today. I hope that that for those of you that were here yesterday for the Evolve conference, I hope that you had a great day full of interesting sessions and also an interesting evening out. I know that there were lots of parties and mixes going on. I guess it was probably a great day so long as you didn't have any money on Brazil to win the World Cup. But that's, there you go. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the three very familiar faces that we've got on stage for our opening keynote. The first is Michael French, who is publisher of Develop magazine and Develop website, who will be a familiar face to many of you. The second is Andrew House, who has had a very distinguished career in the games industry and is currently president and group chief exec of SCEI. And the third is another familiar face who's no stranger to the Develop conference down here in Brighton, and we're delighted to welcome him back, and that's Mark Cerny, who is lead architect on PlayStation 4. So without further any more from me, I'm going to hand you over to Michael for 20 years of PlayStation, 40 years of console games, and the next 100 years. So over to you. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Andy. As Andy says, today's keynote is an interview with Andrew House, President and Group CEO of Sony Entertainment, and a 20-something, I've got in my notes here, so 20-something years veteran of the video games business. And Mark, who's a long-term game developer in his fourth decade as a game developer, is also most recently known as lead system architect of the PS4. And he's also tonight's honoree at the Developer Awards as Development Legend. Today I'm going to quiz these legends about the history of PlayStation and their role in it. I think a lot of people know that now that they have shaped the current history of PlayStation, but there are some untold stories of where they were when PlayStation began and their impact in that. So where I'd like to start, Andy, is with yourself. So sure. You were a long-serving Sony staff member, and you were there prior to PlayStation, is that correct?
Yeah, I was already working at Sony Corporate as a corporate PR guy, and PlayStation originally came along as a secret project called PSX.
Right.
And it's really hard to sort of think now about how it was sort of viewed within Sony, and it was viewed extremely negatively by a large part of the corporation. So I actually volunteered for the project.
Right.
It was a case of anyone want to volunteer for this, and nobody put their hands up except for me. And then I sort of got to meet Ken and some of the original founders even before the company was formed, as we were sort of managing message and working this out. But I do recall, when I eventually made the switch and moved over to SCE, my then boss, said I was an idiot and why would you go work on a toy?
Right.
Because this is a toy. And the other great quote was that this will never be a serious part of Sony's business. Okay. So I guess there was a sort of bit of a revenge mission for me to prove them wrong. But yeah, we've come a long way since then.
Okay. And why were those other people at Sony so skeptical about it? Was it just the fact they thought it wasn't a legitimate electronics product like everything else Sony was doing?
Yeah, I mean, they saw games as an extension of the toy market. They saw it as something for kids, and that was just not what should be in Sony's DNA. Unfortunately, a sort of small, very passionate group of us fundamentally disagreed with that and thought that there was great potential to start with games and then move into an area of disruption of entertainment overall, and I think that's been sort of SCE's stated mission.
Right, okay. And you mentioned Ken there, Ken Kutaragi, who was the leader of PlayStation in its first few generations. What was his vision for that console and the platform generally, and how did that develop?
Actually, one of the things that convinced me to sort of make the leap and move across was that he had a very fully baked vision for what this was going to be. And it all centered around moving games in terms of the distribution model to CDs. And there was also, what went with that was what I would call a philosophy of inclusivity. That if you disrupted the market and moved away from cartridges and moved to CDs, you could lower the cost of entry for people. That would lead to a far wider variety of game teams and game development taking place. And by doing that, people could take more risks, and we would really see new kinds of games that we hadn't seen before. And I think that's something that I've sort of held very, very dear to me. And certainly when I took on leadership, that we remained true to those principles. But they really were there at the founding level. And he had a fully baked vision of how moving to CD was going to transform retail, it was going to transform development, publishing, and also the platform itself. And it was extremely compelling and I think just very impressive that someone would think through not just the technology as an engineer, but think through the fully baked business model of how he planned to change games.
Okay. And what was the reaction from the wider games industry at that point? Because obviously, if you're experiencing skepticism kind of in the business you're in, and then you're offering up something more revolutionary and transformative. And we know the story afterwards, obviously, that it all came true. But was it hard to convince people into what you were doing at PlayStation?
Oh, very much so. And I think it was extremely hard to convince the publishing community that we were viable. What you had at the time, into sort of the early 90s was, a hegemony which was, dominated by Nintendo and Sega. And we were felt to be a complete challenger. The industry had just come off the back of the 3DO experience and seen how that had gone. So I think that even exacerbated the skepticism that was there. And it actually, the Sony antipathy to video games and also the sort of challenger brand status actually led us to, sort of take the SONY brand out of a lot of the early brand, the communications.
Well,
And there was a feeling that we were a very small company, a small sort of startup within Sony, and that if we were going to build something, we needed to build it around the PlayStation brand and around giving meaning to that.
Okay.
And I think that was an important part of the early design.
Sure. Okay. We'll come back to some of those points about inclusivity, I think, as the story develops. But Mark, so concurrent with Andy's early career on PlayStation and at Sony, you joined the industry far before that. I mean, some of this story you told at great length last year in your keynote, but let's kind of recover some of that. I think is really useful. So, you were an early starter into video games.
I got going in January of 1982, so about 6 months before the bottom fell out of the coin-operated game market. With that timing, I joined Atari Games, which was great because I got to work with my childhood heroes, guys like Ed Logg and Dave Toyer and the like. I mean, to put this in perspective, this was 3 months after the release of Centipede.
Right. Okay.
And after the arcades went into their problem years, I ended up getting into the console business, moving to Tokyo and working for Sega. By the time PlayStation was coming out, though, I was back in the U.S. and at Universal Studios running their video game group.
Okay.
So I had a very early dev kit. And Andy was talking about the skepticism of the publishers. Well, I didn't see much skepticism from the developers. I mean, it was clear that PlayStation was a nice piece of kit.
Right.
And just to put in perspective how different it was, so Sega Saturn, when we got our dev kits for that, it was a 3-foot welded steel cube that would sit under your desk and hum. And the dev kit for PlayStation was about the size of a lunchbox.
Right. Okay. So a lot of instant love from the community.
It's very well done.
Okay. And so as you became a fan of Sony's, shall we say, at Universal, kind of what you were commissioning games for PlayStation as it took off.
So we were an independent developer publisher. We funded projects like Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon, but ultimately we determined that Universal had no sales or marketing group to speak of for games. Ultimately, we all worked out that Sony was much more natural place for marketing and publishing the titles, and so the collaboration started between Sony and Universal on that. I ended up at Sony because the developers that were creating these games, Naughty Dog and Insomniac, we contracted with them and then contracted with Sony for the marketing, the sales. We were just the middlemen at that point, and the developers were very quick to figure out that if they cut out Universal, they could get all the money that we were getting. And so at the end, I decided to just leave Universal. I was president of the group. I decided to leave all that and just be a consultant with the game teams because I wanted to stay very close to the product.
Sure.
I didn't think developers of that quality would come along again soon.
Okay. And so, as PlayStation 1 took off, Andy, you became VP of Marketing at Sony Computer Entertainment America. And so at that point, you're both in the US. So how did the two of you meet?
Yeah, this is a story I actually had to remind Mark of because he'd forgotten this, and it was burned into my brain. So I went down to see Mark to pitch him on the first advertising campaign for Crash Bandicoot, which was, if you recall the US campaign, it was a ridiculous guy in a suit, but that you could see his face, and you could obviously see it was a guy in a suit shouting through a megaphone. And so we went to pitch Mark that this was a great marketing vehicle for his new baby. And he was very scary and sort of sat in judgment on us. And the advertising agency team was freaked out. And afterwards it was, how did that go? I couldn't read him at all.
Yeah,
But he signed off on it, and he took the lead with us.
Okay.
And that was our sort of first engagement, right, I think.
Okay. So at that point, you were trying to get Mark's buy-in on ideas.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was pitching ad campaigns. I pitched an ad campaign to Square. That didn't go so well, and we went back.
What product was that? Can you not say?
It was a little product called Final Fantasy VII.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So we did round 3 on that one.
Shu Yoshida, Andy, and I were all on Crash Bandicoot,
That's
but
right,
in just
okay.
radically different roles than we have today. Of course, Andy was vice president of marketing for SCA. Shu was the Japanese producer.
Yeah.
So he was trying to figure out how we were going to localize it. Ultimately, huge success. It was the largest character-based brand ever to succeed in Japan. And I was the product development guy in that mix.
And what kind of, what are your other memories of that period of, as PlayStation took off and you're, building new IPs, as we call them these days, from the ground up and launching them successfully? What was striking you of the momentum at that point?
I don't know. I mean, it was fun working with Andy and Shu. I used to think of us as the Three Musketeers, which I said last year. I never told them I thought of them like that, but we're all about the same age. We were all terribly young. I mean, looking back, we must have been 31 or 32 at the time.
In amongst the visuals here, I think there's a visual of me that I thought about taking out.
I think it's in the next one, yeah.
Yeah, it's in the next set there. It's when I decided to go through my Harry Potter phase before, I think prior to the books even coming out.
It's PS2 launch footage.
It was a trendsetter, yes.
Yeah, that's right. And so obviously everyone knows the story of PlayStation 1 being such a big success, and PlayStation 2 followed, and that broke through at an even greater level than PS1 in many respects, and it just kept rolling. And I think you were still at Sony America at that point, PlayStation US. And what was kind of your objective in terms of what you were trying to deliver to video games and kind of the wider world?
Yeah, I think by that time I was handling a dual role, so I was still in charge of marketing, but they'd actually asked me to take on third-party relations as well, and that actually worked out extremely well because there was an opportunity then to sort of build partnerships with key third-party partners that were going to reinforce, the overall brand and platform message. And I think our stated goal was extremely clear, was that, and it tied very much back to that sort of, trying to get people away from thinking about games as just for kids or as a kid's toy. And so we were really trying to, through PlayStation 2, legitimize games as an entertainment medium. And at least within US culture, there were 2 ways to do that, and that was via celebrities and sports people and athletes. So we did things that, now I think are sort of fairly marketing commonplace, but were fairly new at the time. We gave out, PlayStation systems, I think, to every team in the NBA, and they were very happy to have those and know where the athletes were of an evening playing PlayStation, as they told us later. And then we started to organize events that were, sort of around this concept of entertainment PR, of driving this message, of saying if these people play games and enjoy it, that somehow that would sort of give it greater legitimacy for people, and it worked out well. And the other sort of key partnership, I think, was it was during that same period I met Sam Houser for the first time. and we decided that we really wanted to get behind Grand Theft Auto, that this had the opportunity to be, you know, a sort of transformative experience for games, and again send a completely different message. And fortunately, you know, that panned out extremely well and built a friendship, you know, that I treasure to this day.
Okay, and because that I think people might not be too aware that the very, very well-known exclusivity for GTA 3, which was a flagship PS2 title, was there just as it really exploded. I remember the advertising and kind of the popularity at that point. And that was a lot of your doing, and that relationship you had forged with them.
Yeah, it was just one of those lovely sort of serendipitous alignments of what Sam and Rockstar were trying to do. Just fitted perfectly with where we wanted to be as a platform.
Yeah.
And it just made it such a really easy discussion, and you know, it was, as I say, perfect alignment. And you know, those come along sort of very, very rarely in your career. And you know,
there's Harry Potter.
Yeah, there's Harry Potter. And yeah, that was a big turning point for me of just seeing what the power of a single franchise could do, you know, for an overall platform.
Sure. Okay. And Mark, at that point, you you went back into more of your consultant role, or were you all still in your consultant role at that point?
So I've been in the consultant role since 1998. So yeah, I mean, I didn't end up seeing Andy that much more in the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3 era, just because I was doing level design or engine work or the like, and the management for the developers were the people who were interfacing with the mothership for sales and marketing and the like.
And but your fingerprints, if you will, are on a number of key titles on PS2 and then later PS3, right? In terms of what you were doing in helping studios out.
Sure, Jack and Daxter and Ratchet and Clank and the like, yeah. And I was getting more and more into the hardware side of it, sort of step by step. So PlayStation 2, Shuhei Yoshida had invited me to Tokyo to use an early dev kit and try to, before any were distributed, to try to do the foundation for an engine that Naughty Dog and Insomniac could use. And then PlayStation 3, I ended up embedded with the hardware team, not designing the hardware, but then in Tokyo for months, the year, learning about it with the idea of bringing that information back and getting the stateside first-party teams up to speed faster on it.
And as PS3 followed in, obviously you talked about the market prior to PlayStation. The market changed a bit around PlayStation. Obviously Xbox broke through and things. But you had moved to a different role within Sony, correct?
Yeah, I get teased a lot by long-time Sony people that I moved away from the SC organization just at the peak in 2005, and came back in 2009.
Right.
So I missed the hard years.
I see. Right.
But I was asked by Howard Stringer to become Sony's overall chief marketing officer, and which was an interesting experience. It gave me a sort of different breadth around Sony. But I have to say, with no sort of criticism or negativity, that the single thing it taught me was how much I loved the video games industry. And I remember being at E3 for the PS3 launch, and you can tell many stories around that. But there was this terrible sort of heartache for me that I was not part of this anymore. And so, fast forwarding to 2009, and Kasi Rai said, isn't it about time you came back? And I think
your timing was good.
My timing was good, and I think he didn't realize I'd have taken a pay cut at that point to get back into the business. But so it taught me a lot that about whether you want to be in a corporate role or whether you want to be in an operational role, and absolutely it was operational for me.
Was there much in the back of your mind about how, if you've moved into a bigger role in Sony, but you were told about 10 years prior that this PlayStation business, this thing that wouldn't last, it was such a central part of the business at that point, right? So it must have been in the back of your mind that I've left behind the thing that really did succeed that people told me was wrong.
Absolutely, and it was just. It was a tough period for me because I was managing teams that were all virtual around the world, and no one sort of there day to day in an office. And I don't want to get too teary-eyed about it, but I really missed that sort of day-to-day, being with PlayStation people, working on something that was all of it, a very well-defined shared cause. And so it was just a delight to get back to that.
Right.
And albeit, oddly enough, in Europe, back,
I remember
back in the UK.
Head of Sony SCEE.
The single 2 years of my career that I've worked in my home country, so, ironically.
But so you returned to PlayStation proper in 2007, and then, or 2009, sorry, and then at that point it's the tail end of the PS3. Mark, you're still a consultant working on various titles. And it's 2 years later, there's management change in Japan.
Yeah.
And so what was the opportunity for you in terms of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly well known that Cartridges was, starting to get wider and wider responsibility within the Sony organization, and was handling, I think, at this point, kind of half of Sony's overall product portfolio. And he was sort of starting to feel the need that there was, someone needed to replace him and be 100% dedicated on the PlayStation business. Ours is a complex business. It's got, lots of different moving parts around, our own content, third-party content, developer partnerships, publisher partnerships. And so asked me to take on that role. I made a pitch to try and do the job from San Francisco, and he just laughed.
Okay.
And so said, no, moving to Tokyo is going to be, part and parcel of this. It was, I think it was, for me, it was a wonderful opportunity. And I think there was one thing that was felt that I brought to the role was that I had fairly uniquely, now spent time on the PlayStation business in Japan originally, in the US and in Europe. So had a fairly sort of well-rounded view of what our organization was and could do globally.
Yeah.
So was happy to take on that role.
And that answers very well to this, you were talking about breaking games through as culturally as a legitimate thing, and they had become a more global product anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think recognizing that our publisher partners were globalizing, that the business itself was undergoing a period of globalization. I think also, demanded that somebody would take a sort of more holistic view. And one of the things I've tried to do at SCEI is to globalize the business a little bit. We've traditionally had our success from being extremely well grounded into the regions. And interestingly, one of the things I really like about our company is that if you go to SCE in London, it feels like a British/European company. If you go to SCEA, there's a pub on the first floor in Great Marlborough Street. If you go to San Mateo, it feels like a Silicon Valley company. And if you go to SCI in Tokyo, it feels like a Japanese company. But adding a sort of layer of just global functions that really just didn't exist in the company and hadn't needed to exist because the business was in a different form at that point, was one of the things that I really was keen to do and apply change to the organization.
Okay. And so that was one of your objectives. I mean, the other thing is obviously you come in as president of Sony. It's the tail end of the PS3. But you've got more objectives. Another console. So kind of give me the run up, because obviously Mark eventually became involved. But what's the backstory to doing the next console? What discussions do you have, and what's your objective?
I was involved first, so
Mark should talk to that first.
I've been driving the hardware since 2008, and so we did the whole very collaborative approach to the hardware design. By developers for developers was our mantra, and we'd walked around some concepts, gotten basic sign-off, and built our custom chip. But when Andy came on as president and group CEO at the very end in the fall of 2011, we just had that custom chip. We didn't have a larger user experience. We obviously didn't know what it was going to look like. Games were just getting into development. Mm-hmm. And so all of those major decisions still needed to be made.
Right, okay. And so there's, and a lot of those decisions were kind of spelled out when you unveiled the console, but let's kind of talk through them, because I guess between the two of you and your other senior colleagues at PlayStation, you would have pinned these things down. So there's, from when we talked before this, some of the things you provided were things like, you decided to include a hard drive in every PS4. So why was that a point of debate?
It's a point of debate because it's about $1 billion.
Right, okay.
So,
who didn't want to sign the check for $1 billion?
So,
a pattern is going to emerge here.
hard drives are expensive, and it's not like you can put half a hard drive in a console. And so the alternative is flash, but you can't put very much flash memory in it. And so we were going through the pluses and the minuses, many minuses of not having a hard drive. I must have had 30 conversations on that issue alone with the developers, looking for some alternative, looking for some way to preserve everything that the players wanted while still getting the hardware out cheaper. And sort of was just coming to the conclusion we needed a hard drive and to spend $1 billion as Andy was coming in the door.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. And the reason it's such a large decision is because you were making a commitment not just to the initial launch of the platform, but that's it. You're in for the life cycle, and that has massive implications for how it's going to shape the business model over a long period of years. But on a couple of these things, I think what was great was that Mark advocated in a very succinct, neutral way for what this was going to mean for developers and, by extension, the user experience. And yes, we debated, but it became extremely clear to me that, financial issues aside, that we had to be striving for a certain level of experience that was going to get people to embrace a brand new platform. If we were going to fulfill our own goals as a company, but if the industry as a whole was going to move on, we were starting to get a lot of the sort of naysaying in the sense of what's the role of a console, is there a role for a console? And those two things came together to say that experiences, this key thing of transformative experiences, and that is the lifeblood of what we do in console gaming. And the hard disk, I think, was just absolutely part and parcel of delivering that.
I mean, for the hard drive, we could have a debate like, does every player need downloadable content? Not every player does. Does every player need to play, though, on the other side, say, Watch Dogs the way it was intended? And there, if you want to save money, unfortunately, the answer is yes. I mean, Watch Dogs is a title that needed 15 gigabytes cached on very fast media like a hard drive, or it wasn't going to play at the level the creators wanted it to be. So really, we couldn't go out there and say, yes, hard drive works for some people, but not any. I mean, it was embedded on such a basic level in what the developers were thinking of making. Sure. That ultimately we had to make that decision. I think you had a sleepless night over that one.
Definitely.
Okay, so that's first billion you got out of you. What about the increasing the memory size on the PS4, which is another thing? When you announced it, it was, gamers loved it, developers loved it, but it was doubling from 4 gig to 8 gig from what people knew at first?
The truth is, in the early days, we were saying, do we need 2 or do we need 4? Right. And I walked that around to the developers, and they said, you need 4. And so we put it at 4. But then, definitely we were getting a lot of feedback that we needed to be larger. I mean, some of that was competitive, is wanting to make sure that the experiences were just as rich on our platform as on competing platforms. But some of that was also wanting ease of game creation, is we don't want the game creators worrying about how to shove their memory into shove their data into a small amount of memory. We want them thinking about the experiences. Unfortunately, it's very expensive. We made the commitment to go with GDDR5, which is more expensive than basic DRAM to begin with. So it was going to be very expensive to go from 4 to 8.
More discussions? Any more sleepless nights?
Yeah, I think really? You've got another one for me? And now this? I think also, we were balancing priorities at this point. And, a lot of the philosophy that underpinned PlayStation 4 did, very frankly, come out of our experiences on PlayStation 3. And sometimes these priorities were almost in conflict with each other, and I think this was a good example of that. absolutely wanted to build a platform with strong momentum out of the gate, and that, from my point of view, necessitated a certain hardware price point and a value proposition that could be more than just a niche market right from the get-go. On the other hand, Mark again did a splendid job of advocacy of painting a picture of what the difference in experience level was going to be. And that also, and particularly when coupled with this idea of ease of development, which was a huge mantra for us, again, in contrast to the very sort of bitter and painful experiences that we've been through on PlayStation 3. Well, now you had these two things that were sort of running essentially in conflict with each other, and we had to make a call. And and it was another sleepless one for me. But at the end, I think we felt that our ability as a company to get through, I think we have a fantastic procurement and hardware design group that is going to be able to achieve the sort of economics of the platform that we wanted over time. So in my view, I essentially put a bet that if we went out big with this and made a strong financial commitment up front, there were going to be other ways to offset that, other ways to mitigate that. And that, first and foremost was ease of development, great experiences. We'll manage the financial implications somewhere else in the model, and that's what we elected to do.
And some of that...
And it was wholehearted. I mean, there wasn't, the debate was had. We listened to all the different views from the different stakeholders in the company, but it became very, very clear to me that this was actually going to be an easy decision to make rather than a hard one.
Did it feel like a return to some of those things you were talking about that you did with the first PlayStation, in that was again a different delivery system, a different kind of proposition, and bringing some of that stuff back? Were you aware that it feels poetic in that sense, or was it?
Yeah, and I think it was the difference was, whereas as I talked about earlier, whereas Ken sort of came with a sort of fully baked vision around the PlayStation 1 and CDs as a medium, I think what happened, I view the new version of that as digital distribution, which does many of the same things. And if you've seen, the growth of mobile allowing for a whole new outlet for talent with smaller teams but still great game creation, if you then couple that with, we were starting to get to the point where we had our own, digital distribution network and a scalable network of players with whom we can then treat as an audience that we can connect with independent developers, then we were essentially repeating what we'd done with the PlayStation 1, and whether you call it poetic or just another sort of form of the life cycle, I think the parallels are very true there. And the interesting thing for me, and I was talking about this with some people last night, is that this became a groundswell that came up through the organization rather than anything that was top down. We had two very, very strong advocates for the indie movement in Adam Boyes and Shahid in Europe. And they were starting to make a very convincing case that there were some big opportunities for a console platform if we were to embrace this and try and remove barriers to entry. And for me, that would just, it immediately sparked memories of what we were trying to do with the original platform, of lowering barriers to entry, encouraging risk-taking, having the quirky and the different, as well as the big blockbusters, and it sort of just came together extremely well, and we all decided that this was going to be something we were going to make a priority.
Right. Okay. In one of the slides running through it, it's got a picture of the unveiling of the price E3 last year, and one of the things that helped get you there to that price point was not having a camera in the box, which was kind of it's a piece of PlayStation actually innovated in cameras games on PS2, and then obviously your competitor has a camera product as well. So what's kind of, what's the backstory there in terms of as another discussion you were having?
Well, I mean, that was an easy decision for me because I didn't have to make it. But I mean, it was pretty obvious that, I mean, it's if you do the math, it was more than $1 billion if you do the math for the hard drive, and more than $1 billion for the GDDR5, and it was pretty obvious to me that something was going to have to give.
Right.
But I mean, at the same time, the camera makes sense as an independent proposition. I mean, It does not need to be included with the hardware to be a success. I mean, if it offers something that is perceived to be of value, then it is a great thing to have in the PlayStation 4 ecosystem.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think, again, you've got another one of these sort of points where there were, in the first instance, financial pressures, but it had us think through the consumer proposition again. And I think what Mark's alluding to as well is that if we were making the platform much more about consumer choice than perhaps our previous platforms had been, then having the camera as an option for consumers was not, a negative. That's offering people choice. The other thing that I think had happened is we were starting to see not the full potential, but sort of the glimmering of the potential of what experiences like Playroom could be, of what game sharing and sharing of gameplay could mean, and that inherently was enough to drive this but driving this rather than forcing it onto consumers and then by extension trying to force it onto developers, was saying that if we've got good enough experiences that people will embrace it as a secondary purchase, and happily that's what we've seen happen.
Okay. And you talking about thinking about how consumers then experience the products you're designing. PS4 also introduced a different user experience. 'Cause PS3 and PSP had this unified system, but this is different. So what was the discussion there? How did you decide to redo it for the PlayStation 4, and what roles did you have, both of you, in?
That was actually our first major interaction after Andy took over the president role. So we had a working group, about 20 people, some from inside of Sony Computer Entertainment, some from the larger Sony. And over the course of a year, we spent the better part of a month locked in a room trying to figure out what that larger experience beyond the games would be. And Andy came to one of the meetings. We narrowed something down to 3 options. Andy comes in, he advocates for one option to some degree. We kick it around for 90 minutes, and he leaves the room with the advice that no, a different direction, a different one of the 3 is a better way to go. And for me, that was great. That was a real conversation. That isn't something that I'd experienced in the previous 10 years of working with Sony Computer Entertainment. The idea that your chief executive would come in the door and not just kind of declare what it was going to be, but in a very participatory fashion would collaborate with the group. That was great.
Brilliant. I mean, from that and the other discussions, it sounds like your kind of management style is more listening to everyone and letting everyone take part rather than pushing it down so much.
I absolutely believe in that. I think that, and I credit my own boss with this as well, because it's very much his management style is listen first. And there's almost a cultural element here as well, because if you work in a Japanese organization, there's just culturally a little bit more time and hesitancy that's taken in meetings for people to really get to state their own view and state what they really feel about something. And I think you run a huge risk if you sort of preempt that with sort of some categorical judgment that happens too early in the process. But the flip side of it is that, on the other hand, when push comes to shove, a decision needs to be made.
Right.
And when it's made,
You're still the president.
and everybody needs to get on board. And where that came to a head on the interface was, I was eventually presented with 2 sort of not dissimilar, but on the other hand, really fairly distinct paths around how the user interface was going to look. And they came from 2 actually competing teams. And I thought it was very canny of Ito-san, who was managing the hardware project, not to actually tell me that these were 2 competing teams. But that, as the presentations went on, it became more and more obvious that people were, advocating for their own approaches. And what it came down to was subtle but very important differences. One of the approaches was less challenging, I think bore a lot more resemblance to the cross-media bar, was not as innovative, was not as revolutionary as the other one was. By the same token, the newer approach had sort of content very much front-facing. I was very concerned when you think about the full potential of a platform's lifecycle, you want to be able to have something that resonates with, our core audience, people that are very comfortable with a lot of content and a lot of complexity being placed in front of them, front and center. But you've also got to be thinking about that sort of wider audience that you hope to reach during the course of the platform's lifecycle. So trying to strike that balance was a critical thing. But it became fairly clear that the more complicated, the more challenging option was the one to go with.
Right.
And so I, plumped for that one and said, that's what we're doing, and we're going to just put some more work into that.
Okay.
And that became the sort of essentially 3 segmented user interface that you've got, where your content is surfaced for you in the sort of carousel at top. You've got your settings and other tools that are sort of elegantly sort of excluded from the main frame, and then what's new being absolutely front and center, so that you get this sense that there was vibrancy, that something's always going on the platform. People are always interacting with it.
Okay, sure. But for a very long time, even up to when you announced the PlayStation 4 as a platform, it didn't, nobody knew it looks like as it looks on the screen now. So what was the, what's the story to that? Why did you hold off? Was it difficult to do a big event and a big reveal of something that doesn't exist yet?
This was one where I think we were honestly just a little bit caught off guard, a little bit wrong-footed, because if you look back to our history and our previous reveals, we had generally always gone with, explaining what the concept was going to be, articulating what the overall, package of consumer experience was going to be, and then later on would do a hardware reveal. So this felt sort of very natural and normal to us. I think we were probably earlier in the announce than we had been with previous platforms, and that was a factor. And that was very deliberate. I wanted to be out there first with the first announcement for this generation, because I think you've got an opportunity to stake your ground and hopefully take something of a leadership stance there. And again, we had the experience of launching later than our competitor on the previous platform, and that played very heavily into many of the thought processes and decisions that we made around PlayStation 4. But I think we were a little bit wrong-footed when people said, well, it was a reveal, but it wasn't a reveal. From our point of view, for our engineers, the hardware's coming.
Yeah.
Trust us.
It's just a box.
Stuff okay. So having the 2-stage around that was very much in keeping with what we'd done before. In terms of the hardware design process itself, this was probably sleepless night number 3 for me, because one of my senior engineering executives said to me, and it sort of chimes with the sort of consensus approach to trying to manage the process that I talked about earlier. And he just said, hardware design decisions are entirely personal.
Okay.
So, which is more or less saying this is on you, mate.
Oh, okay.
And so it did become a sort of very, very small group, and it was fundamentally Sumi-san and myself and Ito-san. And the first design was just so off base that I was trying very politely to articulate how much I didn't want this. And I think I broke poor Sumi-san's heart, because he was very bought into this concept. So we sent him back to the drawing board and gave him at least some sort of guidelines. I said I wanted it to have the PlayStation DNA. I wanted an iconic silhouette for the design, because that seemed to be in keeping with our most successful platforms. And the redirect was great. And he then went back from something that was just not what we wanted, and came back with, I think, like 5 designs, any of which would have been great.
Right.
And I was just bowled over. Then we were kind of spoiled for choice. And so we narrowed that down to 2, and I said to him, look, I can't make this decision just based off of sketches, and I need to see it mocked up, and I know that's an awful lot of work. But go through this stage of the process with me. So he mocked up 2, and they sat in my office for about a week, and I just stared at them. And I think I brought 1 or 2 people in who had been with the company an awfully long time, and they were from very different parts of the organisation, and just got their view on it. But it became very, very clear that the hardware design, the sort of parallelogram that you had, was absolutely the one that people were gravitating towards. Sure. Okay. And my benchmark at the end of the day was knowing that I was going to get up there at E3 and have to do this, was what would I be proudest holding?
Yeah.
And I felt very, very good holding that design that became our eventual option.
Are you talking about getting first out to market with the announcement and the kind of unveiling your vision for your platform? As that went on last year, Microsoft went through its own way of unveiling its console. Did much of what happened, what they experienced, did it shape what your decisions were? And obviously, because ultimately in the end, that the moment when you were holding the console actually came after their bigger reveal and other things. So
it was an interesting turn of events. I think that we were, we've been, I think, fairly crystal clear and consistent that we were, for gamers, that we wanted to inspire the most loyal and core gamer audience with the platform first and foremost. I want to be clear that that's not exclusionary in any way. That doesn't say that there aren't opportunities to build a platform into a broader entertainment device. And it's fully part of your intention to build out to the widest possible audience and demographic that you can reach, but you need to start with people who are most passionate about games and most passionate about, you hope, about your platform, and have them be inspired and be advocates for you. And then I think it was almost just made into more of a stark choice because we elected to take that route. The competition, for whatever reason, sort of didn't, at least in the early stages. But the only time that it made us sort of not feel that we had to shift our message, but be a little bit clearer about it, was when a lot of the negativity was emerging around DRM issues and used games and so on. And I remember reading an article literally the weekend before E3 that was basically saying that this is the direction that Microsoft has taken, and it's only a matter of time before Sony adopts exactly the same approach. And that sort of really put me on the back foot, and I went and rewrote portions of my E3 presentation script that weekend and recrafted. We recrafted the presentation because there was now an onus on us not to be seen to be right. Sort of going down the same path. And so all it did for us was make us come out and state very clearly, the status quo has been good to us. Consumers like the choice and like the balance that's achieved, and we're going to stick with it.
Right, yeah.
So it wasn't a shift in strategy, it was just feeling a necessity to go out and communicate something that we just took for granted until that point.
Okay, that's very interesting. In the midst of that, one of the things that was different to the PlayStation 4 kind of unveiling was, Mark went out there a lot as ambassador, talking about, not just talking in a PR sense and keynoting this event last year and things, but also talking to developers and getting their feedback and things like that. I mean, why do that? Because until that point, Sony and, again, the other platforms don't do this either, put a face on the person that made the innards of the box,
Yes, Andy, why do that?
And what did you think of it?
I thought it was great. I mean, we developed the hardware with the mantra by developers for developers, and that morphed into, for our launch event, I think what it changed into was consumer-focused and developer-inspired, which is a bit broader, but it's the same spirit. I mean, we were only creating the hardware for the developers because we know they're the ones who are making the games that people want to play. And so it was a real pleasure to be out there being able to communicate part of the image.
I remember calling you up, actually, and saying, there's only one person I can think of who should be taking care of this portion of the event. And I don't know what your reaction was going to be.
Well, and Mark, your skill set is based on, you're doing well because you can talk to hardware engineers in a conference room. And now, how do you feel about getting on stage in front of 5 million people on Ustream? So,
but you were up for it.
I was up for it, certainly.
Not only was he up for it, and this is, I'm going to embarrass Mark slightly, but so he took on quite a bit of heavy lifting for the early launch event. And when we arrived in New York, I said to him, how are you feeling about this? You doing okay? And his comment was, he said, I can't work with telop. I just can't work with a teleprompter. I said, well, how are you going to do it? And he said, well, I've just memorized it. And I sat there in rehearsals looking at the teleprompter, and sure enough, he had, word for word, just memorized the whole presentation. So your skills know no bounds.
Well, I got better after the first presentation, I think. Thank God.
Yeah,
So
and-
we
and
should
just-
talk. We should
well,
talk.
and
Not
this-
to manage
just
our
the
time here,
la-
but we should talk a little bit about the future.
Yeah, I was
because
going to
think we
say,
only
Yeah,
we've
have
got 5 minutes
yeah.
left. The description says the next 100 years.
Oh, that was overselling.
Yeah.
How far ahead can we look, do you think?
2?
2 years.
Oh, give it 3 or 4.
And so obviously, you know, we know the story about what success PlayStation 4 has been, and we know some of the things that are upcoming, and it's kind of scrolling through in the background, things like PlayStation Now, Project Morpheus. You know, you mentioned digital distribution being transformative earlier. I mean, what's the strategic view there, especially with something like PlayStation Now, which isn't, which is streaming, not even distribution.
Yeah, I mean, you've sort of listed out, I think, where we think there are 3, you know, 2 or 3 potential directions that our industry or our you know, form of entertainment could go. And I'll add in a couple of maybe 1 or 2 other things that I think, you know, are worth considering for the future. You know, our acquisition of Gaikai and our commitment behind PlayStation Now is again very much in the spirit of looking at how the distribution mechanism is going to shift over time. And I think there's an imperative here, not to get too sort of industry political about it, but I think there's an imperative here for us all to consider. And you know, I've been paying a lot of attention to what's happened to the music business. You know, I think someone was telling me recently that the people involved in the music industry are somewhere like a fifth of what they were maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And if you look at the stats on music streaming right now, last year was the first year that music downloads actually decreased year on year. Only by about 6%, but are on a downturn. Whereas streaming is something like 30%, I think up. You know, no one can make perfect predictions about where these things trend, but it says to me that the convenience of streaming, having been embraced, you know, first in music, now in video and television, is going to play some form of role in our business as well.
Mm-hmm.
And our view was that we wanted, rather than having the future dictated to you, is to try and be a pioneer in that area and shape the way that transformation goes. And that's what we're trying to do with PlayStation Now. There are enormous technical challenges associated with it. I think that we're only at the start of a potentially very long road, but we think it's something that's important to think about. Another area that fascinates me is, I think, what we're seeing a revolution in the development of sensor technology, whether it's you know, lifestyle, fitness management, the whole trend from wearables right now. I think we're on the cusp of seeing a huge number of these different sensor technologies get down to the size, physical size, and low cost that they're going to be very ubiquitous in lots of the devices that we have. And I think, I'm no game developer, I would throw it back to Mark as to say where that takes us. But I think the impact of whether it's haptic sensors or body monitoring sensors could play some sort of role in a new generation of games or interactive experiences. And then the third one is virtual reality. And that there's just a sense, you know, that we have that the technology is again reaching that tipping point, or is on that cusp of being something that really delivers you true presence, of feeling like you're being in another world. And when that's delivered, it's really magical. And I think that how far, how large, how quickly that's going to become a major part of what we do, it remains to be seen. But it's definitely that we think is, you know, that sort of magic when you've had that experience and seeing that presence, it definitely leads you to be something that you want to pursue. Sure. I mean, you should talk about some of this stuff as well.
I mean, I feel we really can't tell what's going to be happening even 5 or 6 years out. If you think about it, the tablet that you have, which is commonplace technology today, didn't exist when we launched PlayStation 3, and that was just 8 years ago. Mm-hmm. We don't know what the next 6 or 8 years are going to bring. But I think that the corporate culture that we have really helps position us well for that future, whatever it is. I mean, I look at it, for strengths, we have longevity and continuity, which is now getting up close to what Nintendo has.
Right.
And, you know, Andy and Shu have been with Sony for over 20 years. Our little collaboration is now 18 years in the making. That's getting up there. And I feel that by looking at the past, not in an attempt to repeat it, but, you know, understanding where we've been will guide us in where we need to go in the future. mean, I also think that structurally speaking, we have domain experts. It's very interesting looking at the setup that Andy's put together, and maybe you should speak to this. But you've in the business side, Jim Ryan and Sean Layden, and the game side, Shu, and on the hardware side, me. And we are very empowered within our spheres to go ahead and drive our part of the business.
Okay. You say we a lot there, but you're obviously also a technically independent contractor to Sony with nobody reports into you and you have no employees.
So I'm busted. It's true. So also,
but you clearly feel part of the family enough to, and have done.
It's all a little strange. I mean, if you look at it, we have our little collaboration here, but you couldn't find two guys with more different work styles. You have how many employees in how many countries?
Yeah, coming up on 8,000, I think, in
And do you even know how many countries you have subsidiaries
I probably
at this
don't
point?
know how
Between
many
50 and 100, though, right?
Somewhere in there, yeah.
I have the perfect number of employees, which is 0.
Andy might say that having 8,000 employees is the perfect number as well.
You should try it sometime, Andy. Yeah. It works well.
What do you, in terms of the kind of Mark's talking about the corporate culture there and the vibrancy of it, and you said early on when it was just 2 or 3 of you on PlayStation and the only people in a reluctant company to go into video games. What do you think of the culture you've built, and what's the future of that, I guess?
Well, I think Mark, touched on one of the aspects there is I'm a huge believer in complementary skill sets and management partnerships that revolve around having a full understanding of what you do well as your core competency and having respect for that. And I think we do have that within the organization. We respect what people do within their areas of expertise. But that's coupled with people having equal voices at the table. It's not a perfect analogy, but one of my favorite management movies of all time is The Damned United. Because it's not a football movie, it's a management movie, right? And it's about exactly what I was talking about, complementary skill sets of two people, and then when it's not respected, it all goes awry. Right. And so I think it's a great management movie, I think, for anyone to watch. But and I think the other thing that's going to sound strange is that, but when Mark and I were talking about this, is we have a lot of fun in what we do. Yeah. There's a lot of very strong debate in meetings, but there's quite a lot of laughter as well. And humor is a tool for building camaraderie within the group, testing people's ideas, and whether they're really committed to stuff is an underestimated, I think, management tool in my view. And I'm very proud of the very cross-cultural nature of SCE. It's reflected in our regional operations, as I talked about earlier. But there is a diversity there of cultural background, of skill set that hopefully, I think, positions us well to embrace the future in a flexible manner.
I would say that given the way the development community has embraced it, consumers, that fun and the way the makeup of Sony does reflect in the products and the success. We're just a little bit over on time. I've got 2 more questions. We won't have time for any Q&A, but the final 2 points I wanted to ask you were, what do you think, or what does Ken Kutaragi make of where PlayStation is now, and when he told you this first vision, and now that you're shepherding that business?
Yeah, I actually remain in pretty close touch with Ken. He was in the office on Monday, and I wanted to show him some stuff, and he's got a project that he's working on that he wants to enlist some SCE help in. So it's developed into a really great relationship. He offered advice and perspective prior to the launch event, and I think that over time there's been a sort of a real sort of deepening of the relationship. He was one of my mentors, early in my career in the organisation, and I think you try very hard to hold on to that. I'm in touch with most of the founders of the organisation on a fairly regular basis to this day. He's really pleased about the way that PlayStation 4 has shaped up. I think he feels that it's in keeping with his original vision for the organisation. We get some tremendous support for him, which is just great.
Great. And lastly, to both of you, see tonight, Mark, we are giving you your Development Legend Award, and that's kind of a reflection of your over across 4 decades of work. But what do you both think? What would you like your legacy to be? And I guess it's both a personal thing and then also for the company and PlayStation in general.
Well, I mean, I as a gamer, I like the big titles, and the big titles are fragile in a sense because it takes so much money and so much time to make them. If there isn't a certain stability that exists on a hardware level, those titles just won't come to be. And so, if you're asking legacy, I would like to be able to look back so many years from now and say that, yes, I helped create that environment that allowed those titles to flourish.
Okay.
Yeah, I think similar for me as well. I think I would love for SCE's contribution to have, essentially left the games business or the art form, the entertainment medium, in a more vibrant, active form than it was before we came along.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks both for your time. I think we're over into the break. So it's been really insightful, and thank you for the tour of PlayStation history.
Thanks very much,
Thank
Mike.
you.
Thank you.
Yep.